This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to the November series of 1 month to a more effective compliance program series that I'm running in 2017. This month, we're going to take a look at 1 month of 360 degrees of communication in compliance. This month's sponsor is Dun & Bradstreet. The only thing that is constant right now in the regulatory environment is change. Supply chain leaders and compliance professionals alike continue to struggle with how to best adequately identify, screen, and gain visibility into ownership structures of third parties and or customers so that they understand exactly who they are doing business with. Companies can knowingly finance goods that are potentially obtained illegally or sold on the black market. Procurement teams that are unaware of third-party activities and have antiquated systems, they put their company at risk. Without proper visibility, these teams could unknowingly be funding terrorism or even engaging in human trafficking. In-depth research is needed to identify ultimate beneficial owners and third-party risks. No business ties to corrupt practices such as human trafficking or money laundering is going to self-report, so companies must take this work on themselves and obtain third-party data needed to determine risk, mitigate exposure, and protect their brand and comply with regulations. Dun & Bradstreet offers an end-to-end comprehensive solution to help organizations tackle this exact complexity. Leverage Dun & Bradstreet's complete due diligence reporting to know your vendor and your third-party partners. Do not expose yourself to undue risk. Contact Dun & Bradstreet today to learn more about vendor onboarding, supply risk management, and comprehensive compliance check. This month I'm going to tackle the concept of 360 degrees of communication and compliance. We're going to take a look at it from a variety of ways and mechanisms. We're going to consider the Chief Compliance Officer and his or her role in communications. We're going to take a look at how you can facilitate a two-way conversation of communications while sitting in the CCO suite. We're going to consider some of the leadership and other components of a CCO's role and how they will help you have a more robust and indeed holistic approach to compliance. We're going to consider the bottom-up approach to communications by utilizing communications techniques for your employees, third parties, contractors, and those that may come into contractual relationship with your company through the supply chain. We're going to consider 360 degrees of communications through operationalization of compliance and culture. It's going to be a very interesting month. I think as a CCO, you will learn quite a bit. And at the end of the month, you will not only have information which will allow you to be a more well-rounded CCO, but bring a much more holistic approach to your compliance function. My year-long series of 1 month to a more effective compliance program and the November edition of 1 month of 360 degrees of communication and compliance are a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'm extraordinarily pleased to bring you day one of 360 degrees of communication and compliance. This month will be a lot of fun for you because you will learn a lot about techniques that the CCO can use to give you a more well-rounded role as a CCO, but also facilitate a much more holistic approach to compliance in your organization. Best of all, the techniques I'm going to talk about this month are largely available to you at no cost. They're things that you can do both in your manner of running your position as a CCO and also innovations that you can bring to the compliance function in your organization. Generally speaking, a 360-degree view is an effort that tries to include your compliance identity into a holistic approach so that compliance is in touch with and visible to your employees at all times. It's about creating a distinctive brand philosophy of compliance which is centered on your consumers, in other words, the customers of your compliance program, i.e. your employees. It helps to attract, or rather anticipates, all of the aspects of your employees' needs around compliance, especially when compliance is either perceived as new, perceived as something that comes out of the home office, or is perceived as the land of no. It gives you the opportunity to build a new brand image for your compliance program. So how are we going to do that in the month of November? Well, obviously, social media is a big part of a 360-degree view. So we're going to talk about the use of social media in compliance, how it can facilitate your compliance program and your compliance message. I'm going to give you some specific techniques of social media tactics that have been used by companies. We're going to focus on the culture of compliance and the clash of different cultures that an organization may have, particularly through mergers and acquisition, but just internally, and how a 360-degree view can help overcome this. We're going to talk about the use of storytelling in compliance and how that is facilitated through a 360-degree view. We're going to consider the differences in training and focus of lawyers and training they receive in law school from the needs of the CCO chair and compliance profession. I'm going to provide information on how 360-degree views of communication can facilitate your role as a leader in your company and in your compliance program, and how those types of techniques can provide you a much more holistic approach to your compliance function. We're going to take a look at the two-way street approach and benefit of 360 degrees of compliance and communication, because one of the things I've come to understand that communication is much more powerful when it's a two-way street. You can obtain information from your customer base, in other words, your employees, back up to your compliance program and incorporate that into your compliance program going forward. It can certainly be a positive experience for you. We're going to talk about leadership as a conversation, and that leads you to utilizing the conversational techniques of 360-degree branding so that you can have as many touch points as possible. And finally, we're going to look at how the asking of questions can lead to a much more holistic approach of your compliance program. So when you look at the types of mechanisms that are available for the branding of your compliance to your compliance customers, your employees, you think about print, you think about broadcast, you think about email, you think about social media, you think about events. There's just a wide variety of ways that you can communicate the message of compliance that perhaps you're not utilizing now. And the beauty of the 360-degree approach is to have as many touch points with your customer base as possible. The numbers of ways that, or number of people you can communicate through. So if you take the individual employee, for instance, you can communicate not only compliance to them, but through them. They can communicate compliance to their peers, to their subordinates. If they work with suppliers, you can communicate compliance through them. You can communicate culture and values to customers, the individual line managers, both up and down, direct reports, and then different team members. So when you think about a 360-degree view of communication, you can also bury that down or burrow that down to the individual level of the employee, and then use the employee as your resource going forward. So what are some of the things that your 360-degree view of communications should include? Well, you should start with an objective, because what's the purpose of your communication and who you're going to communicate to? Are you implementing a 360-degree view of communication to educate, inform, change perceptions, or build trust and commitment? You need to identify as clearly as you can the purpose and reason you're doing this to ensure your messages aligns with your objectives. Number two, who's your audience? In order to communicate effectively, you need to understand your audience. Obviously, in any corporation, there are multiple audiences. Who are the key stakeholders in the 360-degree process in your organization? How much do they know, and how can you communicate not only key messages to them, but through them as well, as I talked about earlier? So who are some of the stakeholders? Obviously, the board of directors, senior management, middle management, employees, teams, committees, coaches and facilitators, customers and business partners, vendors through the supply chain, and strategic alliances and business ventures that we talked about in the month of October. Number 3, now that you've determined your communication objectives and identified your audiences, you're ready to create key messages. Each stakeholder group may require a different key message given to them through different channels. I recommend that you create a comprehensive spreadsheet to track the messages, the attended audience, and the message of delivery. Some of the key messages that you want to develop are, or rather 3 key messages you want to communicate are: using the 360 degrees of communication for development, for employee improvement, for continuous organizational improvement, and for moving forward. What about 360 degrees of feedback? This is a key component of the 360-degree experience. And educate each stakeholder on the benefits of feedback from the 360-degree approach. What's the process? Communicate how the 360-degree process will work in your organization. Clearly communicate roles, timelines, expectations, and how the results will be delivered. Number 4, what are going to be the channels that you utilize in your 360-degree of compliance communication approach? You can use a variety of communications channels to distribute your messages. Remember to make sure that the media you choose is appropriate and relevant for your target audience. It can be one or more of the following: emails, teleconferences, printed company newsletters, annual reports, posters and flyers on notice boards, handouts and brochures, banners, website content, social media. You could do a podcast internally. How about that? Intranet announcements, and of course, in-person meetings and events. And finally, you need to evaluate what you've done. So it is important that you monitor the effectiveness of your compliance communication efforts on the 360-degree approach. You can monitor your communication activities by tracking attendance at the events, website statistics, open rate of emails, downloads of materials, video hits, etc. If your objective is to build trust for the 360-degree process, you need to ask, was that goal achieved? Obviously, you can take surveys or focus groups to find the target audience, This way you can discover whether the group has understood your messages, and of course that's your customers of compliance, i.e. employees. And then, was there an impact? Evaluation is important because it allows you to identify gaps and improves the communication process for your compliance program. So what are today's 3 key takeaways? Well, number 1, remember the definition of 360 degrees of compliance communications. It's an effort that tries to include the compliance identity into a holistic approach so that compliance is in touch and visible to your employees at all times. Number 2, what's your objective? What are you trying to do with your 360 degrees view of compliance communications, and how are you using that mechanism to deliver the objective your company or your compliance program desires? And finally, you need to evaluate. I don't think that's something that's talked about enough in compliance, but you need to evaluate how you're going, what the message is, what has the message been delivered, has it been heard, and is it being implemented? And from that, you can use that information as a mechanism to move forward. This is Tom Fox. I hope you've enjoyed day 1 of 1 month to 360 degrees of communication and compliance, and I hope you'll join me tomorrow for day 2. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of 1 month to 360 days of communication and compliance. If you have listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate our podcast, as it would help in our rankings and also help get the word out about the only daily compliance podcast involving the nuts and bolts of compliance. Also, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. Finally, I'd like to thank our sponsor for this month, Dun & Bradstreet. I hope you will join me tomorrow for another episode. The podcast series in November, 1 month to 360 degrees of communication, is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.